Hey everybody, we are going to get started and let all of the technical nonsense sort of settle out as we cross over to 10 o'clock my time. I am going to do my best to stay on top of the chat as it goes, but this is a bit of a one-man band, so I expect this is going to be pretty rough. I have all the questions that were asked beforehand in over here. Little caveats there. I have literally copy and pasted them out of wherever they were asked. So if you had spelling mistakes, then they're still there. I've also stripped off the person asking the question, so that way I don't actually have to do any research and figure out if you're a Nazi or not. If you are a Nazi, I disavow you. So I will give it a little bit more time, maybe 30 more seconds, and then we will get started. Thank you, everyone who asked a question. If you ask a question in the chat, I will try to get to it. Don't ask the question over and over again, because I will ignore you out of spite. Yeah. So I think with that, we will get started. So I'll read them out as we go. What would you like to pull? Or maybe I won't read them out as we go. I will stumble over them. What would it take to pull you out of retirement, like the glorious phoenix I want you to be? I guess what I'll say is I don't think I'm done with video game development completely at this point. I find it difficult to imagine myself at a AAA studio within a large publisher these days, but I think you will probably see some development of some sort from me in the future. Tell me one thing you dislike about Dragon Age Origins, one thing of the game itself, not the world or lore. I don't really like the way that the platforms are so different from each other. So PC is obviously the game that was developed on, and then it was ported to the consoles after the fact. And technical requirements made us have to make sacrifices. But I do think that there are places where the compromises are more than I would want. I also don't really like the where the art direction ended up in Dragon Age Origins. It kind of isn't very ownable. Just sort of goopy Tudor-style buildings. That may be a bit more controversial of an answer. What is the impact of video game discourse online on company workers, and how has it shifted as the internet evolved? It is an impact for sure. There are a lot of people in video game development that are not on social media at all, or keep their channels, or keep their Twitter accounts or Facebook accounts very private to try to stay out of the discourse. It does shape what happens in games, for sure, because you are listening to this stream of commentary, and I do think it can sometimes result in a bit of an echo chamber, where your most committed and devoted fans are the people that are talking to you, and then you kind of end up just talking to that group. It has, in the last 10 years, I would say, gotten a lot more negative. Well, though it's hard to say that with the state that the BioWare social network was in right before it shut down. So I would say that online discourse has always been very anonymous, and has allowed for negativity that you don't see as much in a face-to-face argument, a face-to-face discussion. Games themselves are different and take advantage to their detriment, I think, the fact that they can have patches and never be completely done. And that is definitely a big change between today and when I started in the video game industry, where patches weren't really a thing. I'm just going to quickly answer a question out of the chat, because I realize I'm not going to be able to add it into this deck. The question is, you mentioned that you might do smaller production rather than a large one. What are your feelings on publishers for smaller teams and projects? Interestingly enough, I think some of the publishers are actually way nicer to the small teams than they are to the larger independent teams, because there's a lot of good PR to be had there. You don't need it nearly so much these days as you used to, because you don't need to get into stores. So if you don't get into a store, you still have Steam and Epic Store and Good Old Games and Origin to distribute your game on PC, and you can relatively easily get onto the console store. So I think they bring something to the mix, but I don't think they're a necessity. Actually, I'm doing a talk at my local university in a couple of weeks, which is on the topic of publishers in the modern gaming. So I suspect there will be a video coming out of that as well. So what knowledge or education should someone have if they want to get into QA? I'm not super familiar with what is involved in hiring of QA, but it depends on what you are interested in doing for QA. If you're looking to be a tester and nothing more, then a lot of that comes down to showing you can play the game in non-standard ways and and play the same bit over and over again until you find the faults in it. If you're looking to be an analyst or a tech QA, then there is often programming involved in that. So some sort of background in computer science or programming would be beneficial there. Analysts also can do a lot of stats stuff too, so something there potentially beneficial as well. Have you ever created a character who wasn't supposed to be in any particular game, but they were so fun you made them fit into a game? I don't think this has ever happened. You can see instances where characters have been elevated and become more than they were intended to be. Harding is a great example of that in Dragon Age Inquisition, but I can't think of something where someone was just imagining a super cool character. I mean, to some degree, this is exactly what happens. People who write or create always have kinds of things on the go in the background, thinking about things that could be. So when opportunities go, they slot in. So I guess one answer is no, this hasn't really happened. The other answer is yes, this is actually what always happens. So there you go. Okay, another question out of the chat. How do developers decide which console gen to focus on, given how fast new consoles come out now versus how long huge games take to make? Pros and cons of cross-gen versus choosing one or the other. Yeah, that's an interesting and constant conversation. So Dragon Age Inquisition was on both last gen now. It was on the PS4 and the Xbox One, as well as the previous generation. That was driven largely by the publishing organization, because they were concerned there wouldn't be a large enough install base for the new consoles. Originally, Dragon Age Inquisition sort of was intended to be a launch title for that generation of consoles. That was never really true, but it was kind of sort of true. So it's you're always throwing a dart into the darkness to some degree, but you kind of know what's going to be there. And and honestly, for me, I don't think that being a launch title is probably worth the headache. So you're probably targeting outside of. You should probably try to target outside of the launch window if you can, and then you know exactly what consoles you're going to be on. That being said, Dragon Age Inquisition did sell about 1 million copies on the last generation, so it's nothing to sneeze at. While it was a huge pain, and while it did make the game worse overall, 1 million copies is a lot. Now, the better game that could have been without those consoles would have sold more copies as well, so does it wash out? I'm not sure. I don't think so, but it might have. Okay, something I've always wondered, are there legalities to making fandom into canon? Like, if the fans start believing in one thing, but you all didn't think of it, could you write it into the series? I've heard that writers aren't allowed to read fanfics. Is that true, too? Yeah, we don't read fanfics at all. There are dangers. There have been lawsuits in the movies, at least, of where people have said, you stole my idea and turned it into a movie, and now I want money. I think with the fandom to canon stuff, that's not nearly so problematic, because it's not. It's usually done by a group. It's usually in the public domain. But yes, don't send your story ideas to writers. They will not read them, and in the worst cases, they will block you because it is dangerous. Let me see. I saw something else. Do you think that there is a noticeable difference between European and American game developers' mentality or style in the development process, final product they make? Honestly, I don't know that there is. I think that the culture of the studio overwhelms the culture of the developer at the end of the day. You definitely do see some stuff. There are things that come out of European developers that it's hard to imagine coming out of a North American developer and vice versa, but I think largely the culture of the studio itself is what ends up dominating that conversation. What's the best way to go about going into a career in the game industry? I'm editing a video on this topic right now, but I think just to give an answer here, it really depends on what area you want to work in, but for all different areas, my number one piece of advice would be make something. It depends on what you're looking for, what that something would be. But I would say that the number one thing that will help you rise out of the pack of other people applying would be making something that you're including in your portfolio. Okay, so, yeah, someone mentioned Japanese developers. Yeah, I mean, definitely Japanese games are different than European and North American games, so maybe that contradicts my answer. But I actually still wonder if that isn't coming from studio culture. It's just that in those cases, the studio culture is so different that it's resulting in different games. And I guess you could argue that studio culture is built upon the culture of the region where the studio is. So, I mean, arguably true. What is the number one advice you would give someone who wanting to enter in the industry? Like I just said, I don't know why I put these two questions that are exactly the same right beside each other. Make something. The other thing I would say is, make sure you want it. It's not. It's great because you're doing a lot of creative stuff, but it can be a hard industry to work in, and it's still growing up as an industry. So I would say make sure this is what you actually want. Did BioWare want Did BioWare want to do more licensed games like Star Wars, or was that option left closed after making original IPs? So you make a lot more money on original IP. If you own it, you're not paying someone for the right to use it. And working with an IP owner can be a huge pain because they're telling you what you can and cannot say. They're potentially even telling you which characters you want to work with. Star Wars is very tightly controlled because they don't want you to do anything that's too close to a movie they might be working on or a TV show they might be working on. So once we moved into new IP, it's always there. You think about it because obviously with a Star Wars game, you're getting just an inbuilt fan base, and you've already explained so much about the game from the get-go. But the freedom and profitability from a wholly owned IP, the benefit was outweighing the benefit of a licensed IP by quite a bit. Well, this one's long. No idea if this has been answered yet or not, but I always wondered why games tend to stay away from long hairstyles. Modders are able to make it work, so why not try to add them to games with custom characters? Is it solely because of clipping issues or something else? Okay, so I actually did a video on this. But yes, it's mainly about clipping issues because modders are making things that only need to look good with a specific subset of hats and helmets, and they can clip as much as they want. Games don't really have that option. You are starting to see longer hairstyles in games these days because they can actually make the collisions be less of a problem because you can just throw more processing power at it. But that is the reason, is because handling clipping, handling its interaction with other objects isn't really practical for the game makers, whereas modders can largely ignore those issues. Do you enjoy reading your comments and find them useful? And are you worried that this will change as you grow? Yeah, I am worried that it will change as we grow. I do read all the comments now and actually respond to all of them. I do find them useful, and some video ideas have come out of things that have happened in the comments. But yes, I am concerned that as the channel gets bigger, that will change. I think at 4,000, or I guess 5,000, at 5,000 subs, the anonymity isn't quite there as much. At 50,000, I think people start to feel like they're in a much larger crowd. Hey Mark, with so many RPGs taking place either during a medieval fantasy setting or futuristic post-apocalyptic, my question is, do you think that a modern-day open-world RPG setting, like with a vampire or spy, would work? It's workable. There are issues, and there have been some modern setting MMOs and other RPGs. The one issue that you do run into is that some of the tropes, especially tropes of fantasy RPGs, when you kind of copy-paste modern city setting on top of them, become kind of horrifying. Where you're, breaking into people's houses and stealing their stuff. I mean, it starts to feel a lot more like a GTA than it does like a normal heroic RPG. I do think it can be done, and I think something like vampires or spies would let you avoid a lot of that because you would be able to focus down on a tighter antagonist set, I guess. What time span can be considered as healthy for AAA games? There are examples of sequel games that often take as much dev time as new IPs, but some takes much less time too. I'm not sure I understand that question. In terms of, if the question is about dev time, I think that is just radically dependent upon the genre and the studio. Ubisoft releases an Assassin's Creed, or at least they used to, every 12 months. Granted, they were staggered studios, but still, they were doing that in 24 months. Bethesda, on the other extreme, we are now up to 10 years since Skyrim came out. That's a very long time. Was there ever a serious discussion on making Dragon Age into an MMO? Depending on the answer, why not? If you could have, what would you have done to make it stand out? I feel like we talked about Dragon Age as an MMO in the before Dragon Age even existed, because I feel like in the early days of Dragon Age, everybody was talking about making an MMO, because on paper MMOs look like they are the best monetary consideration ever. Oh, I just need to get a couple 100,000 people playing every month, giving me $15. We'll make so much money. As Star Wars: The Old Republic went on and the cost of making an MMO became more and more clear to BioWare, I don't think BioWare would ever consider making another MMO, just because the cost involved is so big. And so, in terms of how would we have made it stand out, we never got far enough to be able to answer that question. Did BioWare get approached with making games for other companies? I assume this is a question about before we were purchased by EA, and absolutely, we talked to lots of publishers. It's all about trying to get a deal that lets you work as best you can. I mean, we worked with Microsoft directly on Jade Empire and KOTOR. So for sure, once we got bought by EA, no. Though weirdly, Sonic Chronicles was published by Sega after we were owned by EA, just because of the way the timing worked out. I'm curious how devs filter out a fan-based feedback and how fan reactions, opinions factor in any way when it comes to decision-making. They definitely factor in. You are listening to the fan base all the time. Should we listen as much as we do? I'm not always convinced of that, because sometimes you're listening to a subset of what people actually want. You're just listening to your most engaged fans, and sometimes what they want is at odds with what the larger audience wants. Often not, so it's still worth listening, but you do have to think about whether or not they are representative of what the actual gaming public as a whole wants, or not the gaming public as a whole, your potential player base as a whole wants. Should I create bald characters to increase FPS? Well, they are cheaper, so yeah. Let me just get down to the bottom here. Do you have any advice or resources for making new IP? I guess this would be seen as a bigger topic, so you might be out of scope, as you could approach it from many angles. A video, maybe. Yeah, I mean, I can't do in a minute advice on making a new IP. Honestly, I guess here's my one piece of advice for making a new IP is it doesn't need to be as complete as you might think it needs to be. You can kind of make it up as you go, but as you make rules, stick to your rules. So don't make too many rules because you want to stay consistent to your rules, but as you need them, you can add more rules. I think, not that it's a new IP, but when you look at what the MCU has done, is they are retroactively making it all make more and more sense as they go. That's really, honestly, the way to go. Don't dump a bunch of lore on the player in the first 3 seconds. They don't care yet. With all the current talk around various studios regarding remakes, remasters, as a game dev, which of the two do you prefer, and which do you feel adds more value to the IP? Many thanks, and keep up the good work. Okay, so... well, thank you. So, I assume we're talking like a remake would be making it from the ground up, and a remaster would be up-resing and making it work on new hardware. I think that a remake has the opportunity to add a lot more value to the IP. I don't know that you want to always go as far as Final Fantasy VII did and make a totally different game with a different ending and everything, but I think it gives you an opportunity to go in there and bring the conversation forward. A remaster is just revisiting what you've already done. That's not to say it's not great, but it doesn't really add anything to the IP. It just brings the conversation forward. In terms of which I prefer, I think it really depends on the game itself. I think for a game like Dragon Age Origins, it's hard to imagine a remaster because of just the technology that's under the hood there. But a remake would also be a huge undertaking. So I do think that beyond a certain time threshold, I think a remaster becomes impractical, and a remake is the only way you can go. How difficult would it be for a small studio to work a deal to make a licensed game of a big but not huge IP? Do usually the IP holders get a percentage or a fixed sum? IP holders almost always get a percentage, but it really depends on how you negotiate the deal, and it depends on what you mean by a big but not huge IP. But yes, usually they're getting a percentage off the top, which is why why licensed IP isn't as economically attractive often, because every single game you sell, you're making a little bit less. You're making a little bit less money than you would make on wholly owned IP. My best advice is, if you're looking to do that, is find someone who's really good at negotiating, who can knock on doors, like a biz dev person of some sort, because whoever owns that IP is likely willing to talk for a paycheck. You just need to convince them that you're worth working with. If they think you're going to sell 20 copies, they're not going to want to sign a deal, or they're going to want a fixed amount of money. If their IP is sitting fallow, they're going to be more interested to the conversation as well. Who's your favorite character from Dragon Age? I think it's almost become a joke that I give a different answer to this question every single time. I think today my answer is Harding, and is it Harding because I said Harding 5 minutes ago? Probably, but I like that Harding is Harding's introduction is she just literally murders like 10 people in her first 5 seconds, and then goes hiya, and I just think that's hilarious. Can you talk a little bit about how BioWare writers and their role in dev cycle might have been different from other studios? I feel like at peak BioWare, this was their best asset. So you are seeing writers at studios way more today than you used to see. I would say that 10 years ago, BioWare there were probably 10 studios that had writers. Then 10 might be very generous. You still see at BioWare and other story-driven companies, the writers have more. They're out front more. They're setting direction more than at some studios. At the most extreme other end, in some places that have writers, the writers are literally there to spackle over whatever everyone else has made. So make this level that we made with this cool bit of gameplay, and this level that we made with this cool gameplay, make them make sense, make them touch each other. That's not how it works at BioWare, so that's the primary difference. Why did Dragon Age push more towards an elven-focused story? I don't know that it really did, but unless this is sort of a like Soulless, but there's been a path that it's been going on. We largely try to keep as many threads. BioWare tries to keep as many threads in Dragon Age open as possible, and then sort of pull on the threads that they find interesting. So there's no particular goal there that I'm aware of, at least. When games launch with huge design flaws, like incredibly OP mechanics, what is the explanation behind how something so jarring was allowed to go through? So that there's a variety of answers to that question. It could be because some designer changed an ability literally as the thing entered cert, and it never got caught by QA because there was no time. It could be that it was caught by QA and it was decided that time to ship, too late. It could be that it was intentionally OP and it was designed that way on purpose for some reason. So there's not really one answer to that question. Is there any particular colleague, team, game mechanic, etc. that you'd like to get a chance to work on with again? There are, but I don't really have any specifics. I do think that I want to push a little bit on conversations and see about maybe some different ways to get emotion across through conversation systems, but we'll see if we get there or not. If you ever get a chance to remake a non-BioWare classic game, what would it be? So one of the most formative games for me in terms of me as a developer is actually the Dark Cloud and Dark Cloud 2 from Level 5. So I would kind of love to get a chance to kind of poke around inside that game, so maybe that one. Is cereal a soup? Now, I assume that this was asked as a joke, and if it was, my answer to this is a very busy pool a soup? But if it wasn't asked as a joke, I'm going to try not to do 25 minutes on is cereal a soup, but I think that this and the hot dog is a hot dog a sandwich question is the social media sphere trying to grapple with a larger philosophical question, which is how do you... I think that we as a people, as a society, have become really bad at making connections, at living in places where we have fuzzy boundaries between things. And so, is cereal a soup? It's not a soup, but you can't quite articulate why it's a soup because it seems to meet all the definitions of soup, doesn't it? And I feel like that we need to holistically become better at understanding these softer boundaries between things. We've become so obsessed with this sort of hard definitions of things. The Neil deGrasse Tysons of the world talking about such like hard, as if everything is a binary, and it's not. And words have definitions, but those definitions evolve and change, and they should evolve and change. Our definition of what marriage means has changed over the last 500 years. Our definition of what a person has changed over the last 500 years. And just because there's not a clear, sharp boundary between what is and isn't something doesn't mean there isn't a boundary. And I think that this kind of question is often used to force the discussion into one extreme end or the other. If cereal is a soup, then you basically render soup to have no meaning. And if you define soup so rigidly that cereal isn't in that definition of soup, then you end up with a definition that's so rigid it excludes a bunch of other things. We need to become more comfortable accepting these fuzzy middle areas where there's a lot of gray. How long did I do on that? Okay, it was only 3 minutes, so that's not so bad. Okay, well, so that went on long enough for people to ask a whole bunch of questions. From developing mods, my experience is that the devs are simply not as good at the game as other players. That's true of a lot of the devs, actually. There's usually this one guy in QA that has completely busted it, but yes, actually often the devs are not as good as other players. It's true. What genres did you used to play that aren't around as much that you miss experiencing? You know, I kind of feel like every genre has come back to life in the Steam and indie space. So I've put entirely too much time into Factorio, which is just, it feels very old school to me. As you're developing a game, how is it being determined that your game mechanics and story are fun and interesting? Do you hire QA that are familiar with the genre or are known for liking that genre? How can you consistently gauge this as a game is implementing new systems or iterating on old ones without constantly need for new people? Or is this the only solution? I'm curious about this process works or what you've learned about it. So that's exactly what I've always done, is you bring in new people. You need fresh eyes. You have some people in QA that are actually really good at, I don't know if they hit themselves in the head or something, but sort of forgetting the experience and reiterating the new user experience. But really, even that is flawed and has boundaries. So you bring in people that don't know the game and get their fresh eyes. Every time you bring in new QA, and you're bringing in new QA throughout the later half of the game as the team is getting bigger and bigger, you have them do an initial, like, sit down, play this, give us your experience, give us your thoughts. So that's how you do it. There's also you do focus testing, and you bring in like meta rating people who try to tell you what the reviewers are going to say. I'm not convinced that those are the best, but it's basically fresh eyes. Fresh eyes is the answer. How much do you play the games you've worked on, and what does it feel like to play them? During development, I play them. I don't believe I've ever finished. I've seen the ending of every single game I've worked on. I don't know that I've ever finished any single game that I've worked on after it shipped. It feels like looking at something that you had to ship and you can see all the flaws of. I don't find it a particularly enjoyable experience to play things that I worked on. I don't know why I didn't make this 2 questions, but okay. With it being a competitive field with not that many junior jobs available, how does one increase their chances of getting hired as a game writer? Knowing that makes games is the best way to improve my chances. So I guess you answered your question already. That I know of. A second question, for someone with a creative writing background, other than text-based games, what little to no programming game engines are out there to make a game that's a little more complex, short RPG, 2D games, other small stuff? Honestly, I wouldn't scoff at something like Twine, which is 2D, which is text-based. But RPG Maker is pretty easy to use, and you can make something that's a real game out of that. If you're trying to be hired as a writer, the biggest thing you need to do is show that you can work in the interactive medium. So something like Twine is fine. If you're looking to be hired as a designer, yeah, something like RPG Maker will show you can make things. Is the Fade a serial? So I had a pitch at one point that the Fade and the Dreamscape from Jade Empire and Hyperspace from Mass Effect were all the same space, so that you could then have crossovers. It's not widely accepted, obviously. Oops. Over the years, Bioware has built games in many engines, one of which was notoriously difficult to fit for the type of game in making. How do you plan a production around new unknowns and train your devs to work with a new framework or game engine? What other production challenges has it led to? So, I'm going to be frank. I think that every engine is hard to make the game you're making it with. And I assume you're talking about Frostbite here. I think if you look at Mass Effect 1 built on Unreal, they had more challenges making that game than Dragon Age Inquisition had using Frostbite. But the big difference was Dragon Age Inquisition went into that knowing that it had to respect the engine. So that's the big thing. Respect the engine, understand what it can do, understand what it can't do. You're going to be building new tools. Every experience is about learning what's new and what's different from what you're used to. It's weird because I would argue that BioWare actually has such a bad track record of making true sequels that even when it's made a sequel built on the same engine, it's changed so much that this has been the experience every single time. So prior to the adoption of Frostbite, how big a client of Unreal Engine was BioWare? Not really very big, truthfully. Were devs at BioWare able to get more or less help from UA support than, say, after the swap to Frostbite? No, there was a wall built between the Mass Effect team and the Dragon Age Origins team because there was such a worry about the Epic thinking we were stealing their code or something. I don't think they actually cared whatsoever. But I would say that our relationship with Epic stayed basically the same throughout all of that. How would you describe the ideal villain in a story, video games, or otherwise? What I think you want in a villain is someone... You either want something that is essentially environmental, so that is essentially just a hurricane that you are fighting, or you want something whose motivations you can understand but disagree with. You don't want, in a video game in particular, you don't want someone whose side you're on because you're still going to have to defeat them. So that might work in a movie where you can have a villain where you understand them and kind of root for them. But you don't really want to be rooting for the antagonist in a video game where you're going to have to actually stop them. Whoops. Now I made a big mess. Which aspect of the Dragon Age franchise are you most proud of? I feel like Dragon Age has pushed the conversation about diverse characters and forward quite a bit. So I would say that's the one I'm most proud of. Oops, I keep doing that. For kids who might want something to play around with and see how game dev works, do you know if there are simple programs out there that are more like game level design than certain Plumber version? Something they can use to explore the concept of game design on their own or with some guidance, but without getting discouraged or overwhelmed. For reference, 9 to 13-year-olds. Yeah, there are lots of things. I've not tried making something in Roblox, so I don't know how that one is, but you can make things in Roblox. RPG Maker I mentioned before. You can make real games in RPG Maker, but it's pretty well contained. If they were using, I assume the certain Plumber version you're talking about Mario Maker. Yeah, I haven't. I would say look at Roblox or RPG Maker, probably good places to start. Okay. Someone said QAs are expendable, which they most definitely are not. So I don't say that. I feel like some old devs are stuck a bit in the past, which probably doesn't help games with some old design philosophy. I mean, probably. I'm probably one of those people. What do you think is the most underappreciated role in games until you actually make a game? Yeah, tools. You mentioned tools. BioWare used to be tool makers before everything else. I think it's lost that a little bit. But that used to be, I would say, its biggest competitive advantage was building entire games around the pipelines as opposed to building around anything else. I do think tools is grossly underappreciated. I do think in some genres they aren't as important. But in RPGs, you're so absolutely content heavy that tools are super important. Do you have any leadership advice for an inexperienced game dev? What works when talking to people? What doesn't? I have a military background, so learning to change my leadership skills is important to me. Video games is a lot of different personalities because you have a lot of different disciplines as well. So you kind of need to figure out how to meet people where they are. And as a creative field, this isn't command and control, or it shouldn't be, because you're not getting people's best creative work when you're just ordering them and micromanaging them. So you need to give them enough room to find their own way. The exact balance of that is going to be dependent on the person. And I do think the best advice I can give is don't try to emulate somebody else, because that often leads to just truly horrible outcomes. You need to figure out how to lead creative people in your own way. For you personally, when developing, prototyping a new game, gameplay first or IP first? So, if interestingly, when you look back on my career, I have basically never been involved at the beginning of IP development. It's just been the reality of me bouncing around through within BioWare. I don't think you should be starting with IP. I think you should be starting with gameplay. But you can go either way, because you can start with IP, and if it's compelling, you can kind of build a game around that. But the thing that's going to make a better game is starting with gameplay, for sure. Yeah, how is it going to work for Solus then? Some players are very much on his side. I guess stay tuned. It's not my problem anymore. Oh yeah, so I got a whole slide. Someone asked, call to action, question mark? So if you are sticking with me, I have no idea how many people are on here, 49. Give this video a like, because it will spread it more. And maybe subscribe if you're not a subscriber, though I don't have any idea how you found this if you're not a subscriber. Did BioWare EA have most of its employees as exempt at will, where they could ask for lots of casual overtime, or all hours book kept for your years there? While I was there, it actually changed. For most of when I was at BioWare, they were all full-time, not hourly and exempt, but the rules changed in Alberta, and below a certain level of seniority, they all became non-exempt. So they got paid overtime if they worked any overtime. And I'm not sure the impact that's going to have on the culture, because you end up with essentially 2 tiers of employee. And one of the consequences that comes with you're getting paid overtime is you don't get other things. So it did change while I was there, but I haven't really seen the fallout completely yet. How easy or hard is it to pitch a new game IP to the studio heads, or is it a formalized process? The short answer is you don't get to pitch a new IP to the studio heads unless you're basically Casey Hudson. And even then, it's not a formalized process because it happens so infrequently, but you're basically making a pitch to each person above you until you get to the CEO, and every single person above you probably has an 80% chance to say no. So it's incredibly difficult to do. What's a game need to survive to thrive? You said in December Dragon Age 4 would thrive without you, but most of us have some concerns. I think it's about. A game is not built by a single person. It's built by a team, and it's about the whole. It's not about any one individual. So I think if you have people in place that know what is in the what's in the DNA of the game, then it's in good hands. I think it's worth remembering that I am the person who came on to ship Dragon Age Origins. I am not the person who was on for most of its development from a leadership perspective. So this has happened before, and it can be fine. Hi, Mark. Can you share anything? I actually don't know how to say this word. Solace related to us, maybe something that was planned but never done, or perhaps did they do it, or anything really. I put this in here just so I could say no, because I'm not going to either steal a card out of BioWare's deck, or potentially spoil something, or or otherwise reveal what they're planning to do. Honestly, anything that was planned could still happen. Anything that was planned when I left might have already changed out from underneath me. So my answer is no. I don't have anything to share there. How do you grow a team? How does that advice change as the total team size expands? I mean, the biggest thing is if a bigger team can grow more quickly, because you need a certain amount of interaction time to integrate new people. So if you have a team of one and you're bringing in one more person, you should very slowly digest that second person. If you are a 200-person team, one person is going to get absorbed into the team very quickly without having a big impact on the culture. But you do need to pay attention to your culture and try to go slowly enough that there's time to keep the culture whole. If a BioWare game were to receive a remake, which one would the most likely or best to remake? I mean, I assume in this case we mean remake as in ground up. Honestly, if anyone was to receive a remake, my guess would be it would be Dragon Age Origins, only because I think that a remaster would be so difficult for that one that it might end up having to be a remake. What are game devs interested in from a writer? What be important to talk about in an interview? What skills to emphasize, etc.? The number one thing there is show that you can work in the medium, show that you can work in an interactive medium, because writing a screenplay, writing a novel is not the same as writing for games. What changed in game industry during the last 10 to 15 years that you consider a good, welcome change? I think that the industry is trying to grow up and be less frat bro-y, and trying to care about diverse opinions at the table, trying to care about different opinions. So I think it's a welcome change. It's still an ongoing change, however. Whoa! I've got a few full-on Pepe Sylvia question. I'm not sure if I'm connecting non-existent dots, but I noticed that a lot of online games these days have overlapping dates for events, like Tarkov will wipe the same day Apex gets a new season, Overwatch begins a limited time event, then Rainbow will also start one. Is this actually a thing or just a coincidence? I ask because Apex introduced a playable character named Valkyrie. A Rainbow Six operator shares this name, and shortly thereafter Rainbow had a season called North Star. Valkyrie's father was a North Star pilot in Titanfall. So this kind of is true. So if you're running a live service, you want events all the time. You also know when other people have events, and so you don't necessarily, you are either choosing intentionally not to compete with them or intentionally to compete with them. So yeah, it's not like they're collaborating, but there is a certain amount of awareness of what's going on around. And so at different companies, they're not talking to each other, but they know what's going on, and they will either intentionally go head-to-head because they think they can beat them, or intentionally dodge out of the way because they think they can't. Regarding crunch, in your experience, was EA or BioWare more or less responsible for the level of crunch on the games you worked on? that's unanswerable because EA never mandated crunch ever once at any studio at least in the entire time that I was there, because that's not the way the corporate structure is. However, they can apply immense amount of pressure on both budget and time, thus making things like crunch inevitable. So it was all triggered at the BioWare level, but instigated higher up potentially. What's a common camera manipulation trick you can share? Recently attempted a Super Monkey Ball recreation using Unity and coded out a floor tilt and many other things. Only do some research and realized that Super Monkey Ball devs didn't actually tilt the floor. It was just a bunch of camera tricks. So if you play Mass Effect 1, I wonder if they changed this in the remaster. I don't know. But if you play Mass Effect 1, the not remaster, you can actually, if you sprint, you don't actually go any faster. It's just a camera trick to make you look like you're going faster. Let's see. Think it's possible to break into AAA space as an older, not a recent college grad dev? Seems like most studios only hire interns and recent grads. I think it is possible, for sure. It really depends on what you are looking for from a department perspective. BioWare has definitely hired older people into production because a lot of that is very transferable skills from other industries. So it's certainly possible, absolutely. As photorealism becomes more common in games, what, in your opinion, will drive the development of visuals in games overall? From a development point of view, what's the difference in effort between making a game that runs in 4K as opposed to 1080p, or 30 versus 60? And do the pressures to develop higher frame rates and resolutions come from internal or external sources? It depends on the genre again. Higher frame rates is very important in certain genres, but absolutely it is... I know that sometimes the gaming public says they don't care about visuals, but that's not the reality to how they actually behave. And so then you end up in an arms race with the other devs like the other dev studios around visuals. Do I think that we could all maybe give it a break? Absolutely. Is it going to happen? Maybe soon, but not anytime. Not right now. So 60 frames per second means you have 16 milliseconds to do all of the work for your entire frame versus 33. That's a huge difference. 4K versus 1080p, a lot of that can live in the graphics hardware. So the 60 frames per second is, in my opinion, both better because the gameplay experience is better, but also harder than 4K. Of the two. Okay. Isn't KOTOR getting a rework? Maybe. It's not being done by BioWare. I think that might be happening. Do you think that purely handheld consoles are dead now in the age of hybrid and mobile? I don't know. It's possible. I think maybe they are. The business model was always pretty rough on the DS for non-Nintendo developers. So, yeah, they might be. Why don't game publishers or developers invest more in mobile gaming? I mean, mobile gaming is said to be much more profitable, but you don't see many AAA developers making them. Does that have something to do with their reputation or specialization? And what do you think about mobile gaming in general? So, short answer is they invest an immense amount of money into mobile gaming. They're just really bad at it. And partly it's because the way that successful mobile games seem to be developed is very iterative. There's not very clear. Much of your money is spent in live, and that is not how the big publishers think, and so they've had a really hard time working that way. But yeah, like I mean, EA makes the Star Wars game, Galaxy of Heroes, and it's very profitable. It makes a ton of money, but that came at the expense of lots of other titles that were trying to be made. So they actually make tons of mobile games. I like mobile games. I want to play. I want to play RPGs on mobile, but then never do. So I think that is an interesting thing about genre specificity. I haven't been able to get engaged in any RPG on mobile, including ones that I think are excellent. What do you think about longer and longer dev times? Cory Barlog wants to end the North mythology story with the next title because 5-year dev times is so long for more. I think that they don't need. So BioWare is really bad at making true sequels. A lot of other studios have gotten really bad at making true sequels. I think that there is an opportunity not to go full on Ubisoft and make a game in the series every 12 months, but to maybe think about games more like sets of trilogies. So you make a game, you make 2 relatively quick sequels, say 18 to 24 months apart. Then you take 4, 5, 6 years to make the next trilogy. I think that would let you do more with the technology you're investing in, but it still wouldn't wear out your welcome by spending way too much time on one title. Will that happen? I don't know. Why are DA DLCs so unbalanced sometimes? I had to lower my difficulty 3 times in Descent and Jaws of Hakon. DAO and DA2 have OP enemies in DLC. Is this done on purpose or just spending less resources on balancing? So I have, I think, 3 answers, at least 2. So the good answer is that most of the DA DLCs can be played at any time. So the window of balance required for them is so large that it's very, very difficult to actually balance them properly at all. The bad reason is because the devs get better and better at the game, and the QA gets better and better at the game. So they think it's really easy when actually it might be really hard, and we stop being able to notice that that it's unbalanced as well. Is less resources spent on balancing, less resources are spent on everything in DLC, so kind of. That's right, KOTOR is being made by Aspyr. I forgot that. What about BG2 remake? It's packed with great content. So BG, all the Baldur's Gates and Neverwinter Nights for that matter, are kind of an ownership quagmire, I believe, because you have Wizards or Hasbro has parts of it. The Ghost of Interplay has bits of it. Atari has publishing rights. It's kind of a mess. There have been upreses and remasters done by Beamdog for the Baldur's Gates, and they're really good. I don't think there will be a remake. I think that remaster will probably be what it will be. If the Exalted March expansion for Dragon Age 2 would have launched, how do you think it would have changed the story for Dragon Age Inquisition? I have no idea. There's a lot of stuff that was planned for Exalted March that ended up into Dragon Age Inquisition. So that is such a quantum question that it is basically unanswerable. Possibly the game would have moved further north because it would have maybe leapfrogged off of the stuff around the Exalted March and kind of been up in that area as opposed to back down in Orlais and Ferelden, but I have no idea. How is it determined how long a game gets given to be made? Is it basically as long as it takes? So there are a bunch of answers to that. Often the launch date is kind of set on the very first day, which is super stupid, but it's basically what happens because there's this long-term kind of release planning happening. And yeah, there are renegotiations happening there as well. At other places, some places are as long as it takes. But I would say that, yeah, it is basically, we want something about here, you then scope to about there, and then you're negotiating. As you get closer and closer, though, with a public company, that negotiation becomes harder and harder because they're booking that money in the quarters. I'm not sure how far behind I'm falling on the chat questions. Okay. Have you got around to play or Olay Cyberpunk 2077? If you did, what's your thoughts on the game? So I'm not going to get into talking about other games from other publishers and other developers, but I wanted to include that just so I could say that. Maybe I'll get there someday, but that day is not today. I think what most people forgot to ask was how long would a Dragon Age remake take, because if they remake Dragon Age Origin, might have to knock Dragon Age 5 back to 2030s. So honestly, one of the reasons at one point in Joplin days, there was a plan to make a tool set again. There wasn't really any interest within the greater Frostbite organization for that, so it died very early. But one of my motivations for that was to get a tool set that would be sufficient enough that we could find almost professional modders, basically promote them into professional modders, and work with them to remake Dragon Age Origins. There you go, spoilers. Well, I guess not spoilers because it's not going to happen. Would you ever consider reviewing the games you've worked on from a consumer perspective with peppering in between behind-the-scenes info throughout the review? I don't actually think that this would be as interesting as people think it would be, because I don't play games this way that most people play games. I'm not a reviewer. I'm not trained in that. I don't think there would actually be that much I think people think they would find this interesting, and I think you would not. So the chat just jumped again. So let me see. Since Age of Empires 4 released recently and was received overwhelmingly by both critics as well as players, do you think single-player story-based RTS genre can see the same boom as it was in the 1990s? I don't think it'll see the same boom. I think it'll see a few one-off successes. I don't think it's going to become dominant as it was back then again. Okay. Why are stylized art styles not more popular with AAA, especially as they age games better? They really do age games better. I don't know if anyone else is old enough, but when the Sailing Zelda came out, there was huge backlash against that art style. Now it's considered one of the best Zelda games of all time, but at the time it was bad. So partly it is because of player expectations seem very unforgiving to more stylized art styles often. But I think you will start seeing it more and more, because as the technology gets out of the way, it becomes more and more about art direction. And these can be great art directions. Whoops. How is the dynamic that comes with bosses that want to maximize profit and you want to make a moral good game? Does it bother you? Well, it doesn't bother me anymore because I don't work at a public company. Honestly, I do think that boundaries are good. I think that not having reasons to ship often can result in you not shipping. So I do actually think that it can be a net good, and I think it results in things actually coming out that might otherwise not come out. What a kind of experience does it take to become a junior producer? Honestly, it's going to vary dependent upon the studio, but truthfully, junior producer is going to come down to how you do in the interview. Because it's about being able to interact with people and potentially lead people. And if you have leadership experience, that's going to certainly help. But nothing on your resume in particular, other than experience, is going to set you apart. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, at least. Hey, how can I support the channel? Wow, what a random thing. Okay, so I'm just going to mention that at the bottom of your chat window there's like a dollar sign. So if you click on that, you can see different ways you can support the channel. We have the single best thing you can do is become a member, and we actually got a member right before the channel started, so that's awesome. But if you want to do a super chat, it also means I'm more likely to see your question if you're asking a question in the chat. And I mean, I do have some affiliate links from Amazon very rarely, but really, if you want to support the channel, become a member, put a super chat in here or one of my premieres. Watch the ads. Okay. I vaguely recall reading that having staff go on nature trips was part of the planning process of Dragon Age Inquisition. Is there any truth to this? If so, how is that greenlit as an expense? Yes, we did do that. I would say Dragon Age is very pragmatic in its spending, and most of those things were done locally. We also went to Drumheller for reference stuff for Dragon Age 4, but Anthem went to Hawaii to do capture. Hey, look, someone literally just became a member. Well, thank you. So it's greenlit as an expense by me. We have a budget for reference materials and things like that. So the person in charge of the project is going to greenlight it. If it gets too big, you might have to go up the chain to do it. If you're going to go and spend a month in Gibraltar to capture a specific castle, and it's going to cost $500,000, then yeah, that's bigger than that. But if it's tens of thousands of dollars, that's way within my ability to approve. It's very worth doing because you get reference materials. These days you get photogrammetry materials. But also it's good for the artists and the designers as well to see things out in the wild. What are your thoughts on the balance between using proven or at least shipped tech versus building it in time for the current game? So I remade my most sarcastic deck ever in one of my videos. My belief is shipped is the most powerful feature of all time, and you should really respect existing technology even if you hate it, because it shipped a game, and shipped is hard, and shipped is a powerful feature. There's obviously going to be a boundary beyond which technology will age past its useful skill, but absolutely, I would say almost always use the thing that already shipped. I know that you didn't write it and it wasn't done the way you thought it should be done, but Just use it. What do I think about the resurrection of older style RPGs, isometric camera, dialogue box, simpler game mechanics like Disco Elysium? I love that they continue to exist. I tried to play Pillars of Eternity, and Pillars of Eternity is exactly what it tries to be, the spiritual successor to old Infinity Engine style games. And it turns out I had no interest in playing an old Infinity Engine style game anymore. So I love that they exist, and maybe I'll even make one. But right now, they're not games that I'm interested in playing. Another one here. Any expectations from the Game Award announcements? I don't know if Dragon Age or Mass Effect or anything from BioWare is going to be there. I don't know. Whoops. What side skills or soft skills do you think can be a plus on a wannabe game dev? So this is a collaborative industry. Absolutely. Super collaborative. So if you can learn to understand people's perspectives, even when you disagree with them, that can be very helpful. I have watched very senior people argue for 45 minutes about what color fire is, which is they're just saying different versions of orange, but they're arguing and they're saying the same thing, but they're just unable to move from their position. If you can bridge that gap between those two different opinions, that's incredibly powerful. I know that some people feel like they should be able to work on their own, and if you have a studio of one person, that absolutely you can do that. But otherwise, this is about collaboration, and if you just want to work on your own, then I guess my warning is the level of articulation on the work that's required to allow you to work on your own is exactly the same as the level of articulation that's required to outsource to a much cheaper country. So show that you can work with other people. That's the best soft skill. Hey, thank you. I don't know what currency that's in. It's 1,000 of something. Well, 1,000 is a lot. Okay, what would you have done different on the Anthem project? I will definitely be doing a Memories in Retrospective on Anthem when I get to it. But to answer the question for today, I would say that the number one mistake that I made is assuming that the signals and interactions that I had developed with the leadership team on the Dragon Age series would translate directly over to the Anthem team. So at the end of the day, I was misreading the signal that I was getting, thinking that we were finishing faster than they were. I was pushing the stick down, and what I was used to was having that stick basically pushed back up by the leadership team. But instead what was happening was they were actually pulling it down faster, and we ended up landing too fast. Are there any games similar to Dragon Age Origins outside the Dragon Age franchise and staying in the fantasy setting? I mean, that's hard to answer because I'm not sure what you're looking for, but there are other RPGs out there. I guess I don't really know how to answer that question. Do I have a favorite game and what makes it your favorite? So I talk about Dark Cloud quite a bit, and I would say that's probably the one, even though I haven't played it in more than a decade. And what it either did or I felt like it was doing had an incredibly good ability to keep me in its flow channel. So you would do a dungeon and you would sort of grind, and then as you were reaching the boredom point, you would go to the next dungeon, and then you would re-enter the flow channel. So I felt like you were never fully exiting the flow channel. So that would be my answer there. And we just got another member, so thank you very much. Okay. What is the top thing you would like to see in gaming that you have yet to see or have only seen bits of? What would be a dream project for you? I do think that there is some interesting opportunities to be had in emotional communication in conversations. I think we're starting to see that a little bit, but I think that is an opportunity to move beyond simply conversations being a series of dialogue interchanges and to have it more about reading the situation. That's really what I think we're starting to get bits of. I don't know what a dream project would be for me, honestly. We'll see. Oh, thank you, Julia, and we also picked up another member while I was talking and yammering on. Okay. Is UI scaling for super wide resolutions a consideration? It is a consideration. Is it kicked down the road because most engineers are on 16:9? Also that. So we think about it, but it often gets done very late or not at all. I'll just quickly answer this question as well. What do I mean by a true sequel? When I say a true sequel, I mean it from a dev perspective. I mean that this is a game that is built upon the foundation of the game that came before it. So if you look at something like Baldur's Gate 2, it is essentially a massively oversized expansion pack for Baldur's Gate 1. There are additions and new features and all kinds of stuff, but it is definitely built upon what came before it. If you look at something like Dragon Age 2, it's built upon much of the tech bones, but so much of the content was thrown out and the underlying systems were modified so much that it isn't really a true sequel. Mass Effect 2 similarly threw out a ton of Mass Effect 1. Mass Effect 3 is much closer to a true sequel. But even there, it is still making more changes than I think are necessary for a sequel. And pick up another member. Thank you very much. What, in your opinion, have been some of the most impressive projects you've worked on and seen that you didn't work on? You said project. I assume you mean product, but I'll answer the question as written to start. For project, honestly, Dragon Age 2 is the most impressive project I've ever worked on, because that's a team that was able to stay focused and get a game done in an incredibly short period of time. But if you mean product, which I assume is what you actually mean, games like Breath of the Wild and the new GTAs are incredibly impressive, but they almost transcend into something else, where they either have, like Breath of the Wild, where they have such long dev cycles that they can't be emulated, or for GTA, they have such large budgets that they can't be emulated. So those are very impressive, but ultimately strangely not influential on the industry, because they sit so apart from everything else. Most impressive product I've worked on, I think Dragon Age Inquisition is the best game I've ever made. Hopefully not the best game I ever make, but the best one I ever made. What do I think about Andromeda? I will talk about Andromeda as well at a later date. I wish the conversation we were having about Andromeda was they had an opportunity to tell a refugee story or a colonialism story and somehow thread the needle between those two more interesting stories. But instead, we aren't. I do think that it missed something really Oh, thank you for the support. I think that there was a few bugs that slipped through that were introduced very late that hurt it. So I think it got punished both for its stumble and also because of the review scape that it released into. It's a better game today than it was at launch. How about that? Okay. How often does something like mentoring new developers or producers occur within the industry? Are older game devs and producers often helpful to those who are breaking in on the ground floor? So I've been both an unofficial mentor and an official mentor. I think I was more successful as an unofficial mentor than an official mentor. BioWare had an official mentoring process for a little while. I don't think that worked really well. I think that it works better when it's unofficial. Or sorry, it did work better than unofficial. I don't know that unofficial is what you want, because the problem with unofficial is you get a little bit of echo chamber happening. You tend to mentor people that are like you, and you end up with more people like you, and that's not good from a diversity of opinions and voices perspective. But people are usually helpful. Most devs are not so afraid of the people coming behind them that they're pushing those people down, though I have seen that happen. How do we move the industry towards an award show that actually matters, or devs try to win like the Oscars? So devs do care about the Game Awards. I care. I don't know that we're ever going to get the Oscars because we're not as pretty as actors. But like we care about the Game Awards. There's also the DICE Awards. We care. We're not trying to. I guess if you're asking like actual award bait games, that's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know that there are games that are award bait, though arguably EA might keep BioWare around as award bait. What's a bad piece of advice you've seen new folks in the gaming industry get offered, and what would you rather they knew? So for me, I think the big thing, I don't really know a piece of bad advice. I'm sure if eventually I will come to a good answer to that question. The big thing I would say is remember that this is a collaborative industry. Some places end up with very discipline-focused camps, and you are going to get a much better game and a much more successful career if you have the ability to work with people from a variety of different disciplines. I would like to know how big the difference are between the game engines. What are the advantages and disadvantages of Frostbite, Unreal, etc.? So I did a video about choosing a game engine, and I would say that they are different, because of course they are. But ultimately, I think that the gaming public has been misled to some degree, that underneath this, they're not that different from each other. I mean, they are, but it I guess watch that video. Unreal has a lot more devs on it, and so therefore has a much smoother pipeline than Frostbite. That's the major advantage. Do I have any other passions besides game development? For sure, and I'm rediscovering some of those in the last 9 months. We'll see if I want to talk about them in greater detail at another point, but I guess I've been in a D&D group for the last 27 years, so that's a long time. Most games have 90 degree field of view is standard, but most monitors 24 inches will require the player view distances less than 12 inches. Is this ever brought up at the studio? Cameras are a slow motion battle between art and design. So I assume anything that has ever been said out loud about cameras has been talked about at a game studio. Yes. BioWare seems pretty uninterested in modders these days. Unfortunately, I mean, we love modders, but yeah, I get that. It's Frostbite is a barrier for that for sure, because it prevents us from releasing some of the background that would be required. Though there had been a movement, or there was a movement that had started just before I left that might change that. EA is becoming much more interested in the modding community and user created content, so stay tuned maybe. Who would win one dragon-sized nug or 100 nug-sized dragons? So if we ignore the square cube law, then I would say probably the nug-sized dragon, because the dragon-sized nug would only have like flames like this long, and the nug-sized or the dragon-sized nug is going to be really, really big. If we don't ignore the square cube law, then the 100 nug-sized dragons, because that dragon-sized nug is going to be a puddle of goop. Any big YouTube inspirations you have? My YouTube viewing is fairly eclectic, so no, I think. Whoops. Okay. I will eventually figure out how to do this. Okay. I think I'm falling further and further behind. Do I play games for fun? I can only think of games as work. I do sometimes play games as fun, not as much as I used to. I think the most recent AAA game I put any significant amount of time in was actually Avengers, which is a while ago now. But it can be hard because you are always looking at it through a dev lens to some degree. Like how Halo and an RTS and Gears had a tactical spin-off. Was there an appetite at EA or BioWare to have another studio make a game with the Mass Effect or Dragon Age IPs? Not really. We did look. I mean, I would love to see a tactics game for Dragon Age. I don't think EA actually has much interest in that. Really, they really like basically owning most of their production. Okay. Okay, I've caught up to people signing up a while ago. Okay, let's see. Different companies deal with UX differently. What are the expectations towards UX specialists in game dev? So I'll talk about this in my jobs video, but the industry as a whole is waking up to UX as a discipline very recently. There is always a demand for UI development, like people who can literally just put UI screens together, but more and more the desire is for people who actually have some idea how UX works. So there is, this is in high demand right now. I think it's going to get higher and higher as the industry continues to realize that this is important. I think it's actually being pushed, to be truthful, from the mobile and live ops part of the industry, because in those cases, a good UI can make or break your monetization, whereas in a traditional single-player AAA game, bad UI means someone might not fully engage in a system, but on a live game, bad UI means someone doesn't give you any money. With UX, the industry is in competition with companies like Amazon, who have infinitely deep pockets. So it has been tricky to find people sometimes. What do I think about VR generally? When you think about mainstream AAA, will they think the risk is worth it? So EA made I can't even remember it. They made a VR X-Wing game. Right now, the penetration isn't very big, and I question whether or not it will ever be that big, because it is an isolating experience. So if you live alone, fine, but the imagining being in a apartment with your girlfriend and you're going to put a headset on and be completely isolated from them is a hard sell for a lot of people. It might become more mainstream over time. I don't know. I think it's always going to be on the edge. I think if it gets bigger, I think what you'll see first is that AAA will start doing it, treating it as another platform. So they won't make very many dedicated VR titles, but they might start looking at ways to port it to it as if it's a platform. Not that that's going to result in great games, but yeah, maybe. It's Hungarian. Thank you. What were some of my best moments experienced when you worked at BioWare? So for me, some of the moments that I remember the most are when you are at a convention of some sort and you interact with somebody who says, like, Dragon Age got me through a really tough time, or Dragon Age was the first time where I saw a person who was like me and it helped me understand who I was, what I could do. Those are the things that stick with you, and those are the things that that's why I tell people to go to those conferences if they can, because that's really interacting with fans, is when you get to see them up close and personal. Okay. Okay, let's try this again. You said you worked as a programmer first. Did you enjoy it more than managing in the end? It's been so long since I was a programmer. There is what I miss from programming for sure, that I definitely know that I miss, is that you don't get flow when you're in production. If anyone who's a programmer or an artist or a designer on listening right now, like, you get that moment or that time where time slips away and you're just doing, that's that production. Basically, that never happens. Or if it happens for a very short period of time because you're working on a PowerPoint presentation or something. So that amazing feeling of just accomplishment is missing to a large degree from production. I don't know that it's hard to say, really. In hindsight, do you think the change in art style and gameplay from Origins Dragon Age 2 was too drastic? I've come to love Dragon Age 2, and I played on release day. It was a bit of a shock. What I can say is that you can look at a Dragon Age 2 screenshot and know that it's Dragon Age. You can't say that about Dragon Age Origins. So, was it too much? Maybe, but it definitely got us to ownable, which we needed. This is a personal question. What makes me happy? Lots of things, but honestly, interacting with people in this way or at conventions makes me happy. It's stressful for me. It's not my favorite thing to do, but the end result is usually great. Okay. Oh. Okay. Ah! How dare you? Okay. I believe Andromeda got more than its share of hate. Yeah. Agreed. Having worked on titles with an enormous amount of dialogue, writing, and voiced content, what are your thoughts on machine learning generating voices being used in addition to traditional voice work? So for me, I think it is still got a ways to go. I think you could use it for voices that for some reason are supposed to sound weird. So AI voices or aliens, something like that. But I get one of the YouTube ads I get is for Speechelo, like the world's most advanced text-to-speech package. And if you listen, it like the after the click to skip, it says something like, "I bet you didn't know that this was computer generated." And it's like, "Oh yeah, no, I knew it was. You were clearly computer generated." I do think it's gonna get there, or it's gonna get closer and closer and closer and closer. I've seen some amazing things where they take a voice actor's work. So say you take all the lines from Shepard from Mass Effect and you feed it into one of these things, and it can spit out a quite believable Shepard. It can't do emotion very well yet, and there's usually something a little weird about it, but it is getting better all the time. How do I feel about the removal of the human touch? Well, that's a little disturbing, but I do think that having it is really interesting because it gives you the opportunity to potentially in a post-release world release very topical content. You can release a piece of DLC that's written to react to a piece of news within a couple of days and not have to do the turnaround on voice acting and modification and all that. So I think it's really interesting. I think it's going to continue to be an area of research for sure. CD Projekt localized BioWare's game to Poland in the 90s. They also used the Aurora engine to make the first Witcher game. Were you involved in any of that? If so, what was it like? So I included this, and I said I had a story. I was lead programmer on all the Baldur's Gates after Baldur's Gate 1, including Tales of the Sword Coast, so the expansion pack for Baldur's Gate 1. I was lead programmer. While I was on Tales of the Sword Coast, I got an email from someone in Poland who I'd never heard of, at a company I'd never heard of, saying, "We're localizing Baldur's Gate 1 into Polish. Can you tell us how this works?" And we basically got it working. We have this one little question. And they had basically already localized Baldur's Gate into Polish. From my perspective, it looked like they were just like these rebels that had come out of nowhere and were localizing the thing into Polish. I'm pretty sure that there was a deal there somewhere, but I was unaware of this. They had no technology, like they'd been given no specs, no nothing. It was just, they just ran with it, and they basically had gotten it there. I can't remember what the exact question was, but it was something really small. CD Projekt, they were basically like these external wizards that kind of just localized the thing. There wasn't really a lot of interaction between them and us at all, which is kind of amazing. Okay, let's see. Lots of people love Andromeda. Did I work on the Dragon Age Inquisition multiplayer at all? In so much as I was executive producer on the project, so I worked on everything. Yes. The goal originally... So with Mass Effect 3, that team made a big deal out of how much their multiplayer was able to help them improve the quality of the combat for the single player as well. So one of the early goals with DAMP was to do the same thing. That didn't happen because even though it's using the same rule systems, the the single player game is assuming that party control, and the multiplayer assumes not that party control and no pause. And there's just a whole bunch of reasons why it didn't really gel and have that same effect as it did in Mass Effect. What is my opinion on Jason Schreier's articles about BioWare? I'll say kind of no comment. I would say that the video game press has been struggling to figure out if it wants to have real journalists or not. And by real journalists, I mean people that are going to dig around and figure things out and break stories. And journalists like that, they're not going to be liked by the industry, but they might be necessary to improve the industry as well. So, yeah, that's what I'd say about that. What kind of concerns like legal, accounting, HR guidelines limit what game dev leaders can say to their developers, and how do you recommend having discussions around topics that's a communication issue? So I think that more often than not, leaders are saying less than they could. There are limits. You can't, if someone got fired because of a harassment issue, often you legally can't talk about that. If in certain times of the year with a public company, you can't talk about certain things because it's insider information, and you may be an insider, the rest of the team isn't. You don't want to drag them all into the trading window. So in places like that, you basically just have to not talk about it. But I do think that more often than not, there is information that could be provided that isn't provided because of just a desire to avoid hard conversations. Thoughts on NFT and blockchain games? So I don't understand for games that have that already have a server backend, what NFTs allow you to do that you can't already do with the server infrastructure you already have. Maybe this is just going to make me come across as old and out of touch, but to me, NFTs are you're buying a link to something on a server somewhere. So, like the art asset isn't inside the blockchain. So, how is that any better? How is that? What's that accomplishing? Other than now you have to grind through a bunch of calculations to move it around. Yeah, I don't get it. Sorry. Any chance we would get Hawk's marriage scene in Dragon Age 4? Well, I don't know. Possibly. I doubt it. But possibly. That's really a question for BioWare, not for me. My opinion on the future of story-driven FPS shooters. Yeah, it's interesting. We've sort of seen that less and less, haven't we? I do think what we'll see is it re-emerge as a genre on its own, possibly. Maybe the FPS space will finish fracturing, and you'll get story FPSs and competitive FPSs, and they'll be two separate entities. And then the story FPSs might end up having to have smaller budgets because they don't sell as well. But I think it will survive. I think VR lacks the emergent it seeks because they haven't figured out a convenient way to do basic movement. Yeah, that is true. Very true. yeah, you don't. It's not the holodeck. Whoops! I guess I put this in twice. Oh, let's see if I put a bunch of other twice. Oh yeah. Okay. That explains something. Okay. Do you have any feels about how BioWare have been treated by the fans and or the media, especially the love-hate relationship fans have with EA, the amount of negs on social media, and the way you, the company, have been portrayed by the press, particular by the many Kotaku articles? I mean, I talked about social media and the sort of how extreme it's become. That is certainly true. I don't think that BioWare has been singled out or anything. I would say this, that people love a fall from grace story. But the only thing they love more than a fall from grace story is a redemption story. So maybe BioWare's on its redemption arc now. I think people will get on board that. As much as they may have gotten on board with the fall from grace story that happened. How's that? Do you have to take VR... Wait, you do... Oh, no, that's not a question. Done it again. I was wondering if there are any other characters you'd like to write a similar heart-aching epic story, similar to Solus from Inquisition. So I'm not actually a writer, or at least I haven't written, but sure, I would say there are lots. Any advice to indie devs who have to wear many hats? Yeah, the last time I wore a lot of hats would have been on Sonic. I think you always have to don't confuse important and urgent, because urgent can starve out important if you're not careful. Am I done with the gaming industry, or will I join a new company? I don't suspect that I am completely done. I'm not looking to join a new company at the moment, but I suspect that you will see more things from me at some point. From my personal perspective, is it a good idea to bring Shepard back for ME5, or should BioWare let Shepard and their story rest? I feel like the Shepard story is finished. I guess there are ways you could bring it back, but it feels like it's going to be a lot more awkward to try to figure out how to collapse that quantum space in a way that includes the main character. I think collapsing it in just a general kind of galaxy way will be a lot easier. But I don't actually know what they're planning to do, or if they plan to have Shepard in there or not. Yeah, so I'm just going to read that. I'm just going to read Torlak's comment. When the ship hits an iceberg, it seems that leadership tries too hard to put a positive spin on it, while the staff sees the huge gash in the hull. It can make leadership seem out of touch. Yeah, I definitely try to do that less, but absolutely true. There is a tendency to try to get everyone to focus on the nice music playing as the ship sinks into the water. Not useful at the end of the day. Much better to acknowledge what is going on and try to move forward from that. Were healing spells and effects ever considered for Inquisition? During one of the old demos, it showed what seemed like 4 schools of magic for the mage skill trees. Why was that changed? I don't recall why it was changed. I don't believe we ever planned to have healing spells and effects in Inquisition, because With regenerating mana, healing spells basically just results in, after combat, I'm going to stop and heal everyone to full, and then every single combat needs to be capable of killing you, or why does it even exist? In an open world game, you want there to be a certain amount of attrition where the combat is able to scratch away at your resources. Otherwise, the open world can seem pointless. So it was never intended. I don't know what that other tree was. So. Okay. Yeah, okay. Bunch of people also not understanding NFTs. Yes, that's right. Hawk is 33% dead in Dragon Age 4. What do you look for when hiring for leadership positions? So ideally, my preference is to try to promote from within for leadership positions. I've had a kind of a mixed track record hiring into very senior positions in general. I don't really have a good answer to that, I guess. It's yeah. Don't entirely base it upon a good programmer doesn't necessarily make a good programming lead, and a bad programmer doesn't necessarily make a bad programming lead. So it's not entirely based on skills, but I don't have a lot of better advice than that. My only question is, do you happen to know if the stealth and or pickpocket skills will ever come back in Dragon Age? I don't happen to know that. It's possible. Are BioWare games considered CanCon Canadian content? I don't believe there are any CanCon rules when it comes to electronic media, but I would also say that probably not anymore, because we're owned by an American company, or BioWare's owned by an American company. Yes. Rich is absolutely right. Rags to Riches is also, yes. Probably Rags to Riches is the number one. Then Redemption, then Falling from Grace. So those are the three stories that people love. What would be your ideal game if you had complete creative control? If on a completely blank, infinitely sized piece of paper, I feel like that's basically an unanswerable question. I feel that constraints are necessary to the creative process, and without them, you basically are just trapped in not making decisions. Okay. Do you think Dragon Age 4, 5, 6 will ever be like Dragon Age Origins in terms of dark fantasy, or do you think this genre does not sell many copies as other genres in the fantasy genre? In other words, why did BioWare step away from dark fantasies like Dragon Age Origins if they're so acclaimed? So, first answer to that is Inquisition is the most acclaimed of the Dragon Ages. Will it ever return to dark fantasy? I don't know. For me, I feel like dark fantasy can be hard to work on. It can be really draining. It can be really exhausting. I think there are other players in the space that are doing dark fantasy just fine. So I don't know that BioWare is necessarily interested in competing head-to-head against those studios. So, yeah. Maybe, but I doubt it. What I think of Christian Daly, I'm a big fan of Christian Daly. We worked together on Anthem, so I'm not a lot. I don't know how things are going on Dragon Age right now, but I have high confidence in him. Super important question. How do we send you to some more diverse places for your walking videos? Partly, I'm honestly kind of wondering if there's not a way for me to layer them all on top of each other so you can see a time lapse of me taking the same walk. I don't know how I would do that, but maybe. Mass Effect movie, who do you want as a director? I don't really know directors, so I don't have a good answer to that. It looks like I've caught up, or I accidentally missed a whole bunch of questions. What are our proudest moments in terms of impact in Dragon Age? What are my greatest hopes with Dragon Age? So for me, as I mentioned before, a lot of it is about moving the conversation forward in terms of more diverse people in the games, more broader perspective around a lot of things. And I hope that continues. I think there's ways to go. That's my hope, that they keep pushing on that. So, yeah, I guess we've reached the second call to action. So I'll just mention that there's a $sign down there that you can click on if you want to become a member, or you want to send a super thanks or a super chat. Oh, so wait, I don't know if I have super thanks. Super chat, do that. I have no idea what the difference is. And I'm going to thank my existing members while we're here, because they are actually where I make most of the money that I make on the channel. The minority is coming from ads. So I'm just going to quickly go through and let you see everyone, though this doesn't include all the people that became members during this. So thank you to them as well. What happened with the Architect and the Awakening Darkspawn as a plot point? I'm a massive fan of Awakening, but I found the Awakening the most compelling. I think there's a lot of potential with a character whose very existence is a curse. He's out there still, so will that thread ever come back up again? Possibly, but I don't think it's in the foreground right now. Awakening is obviously the least played of all the Dragon Ages. Even though it did have a very good attach rate. So, yeah, maybe. What are your long-term plans for this channel? Do you want it to grow if that means curating and attending to a channel that might draw tens or hundreds of thousands of views? So for right now, my plans are literally just to sort of dump out my thoughts and hopefully maybe steer a few nascent devs away from some of the holes and cliffs I fell off of. Long term, we'll see what it turns into. I don't know what's involved in curating a 100,000 view channel. That probably means employees in order to do that. I'm not adverse to that, but it's not something I'm looking for right now. When a dev has completed a role, what do they do during the rest of the game's development? Could an NPC animator be asked to work on something completely different in the game? Absolutely. Usually still within their discipline. But the first thing they do is they fix all the bugs in their stuff. And for most people, that actually ends up consuming most of their time. But the next thing they'll do is they'll work on things adjacent. So if you are a NPC animator, you might end up doing work on cinematic animation if that needs the help. The other thing that happens is sometimes you can be asked to kind of do almost specialized QA. Writers often end up doing that because they're the people that understand how their story is supposed to go, so they can end up being the best people to figure out if it's working. And then the last thing that happens if you is that they move on to something else. So they might start work on DLC if you're doing DLC, or they might move on to another project at the studio. Okay. Wasn't there a rumor for Dragon Age Netflix show? What are my thoughts on that? I think that would have great potential. In terms of development cycles, is Dragon Age 4's much longer cycle because of changes in game development in general, or something about that specific project? The much longer Dragon Age cycle, more than anything, is been caused by externalities to Dragon Age. So, Joplin started in 2015, late 2015. But then that got derailed by Mass Effect Andromeda, and then got back up, and then got derailed again by Anthem. So if you only count from Anthem shipping, it hasn't been that long. Has the rise of social media helped or hindered game development? Despite gamers knowing the difficulty to create games or animosity against devs online for the slightest delay, or if a game isn't as promised, has even led to death threats, which seems to be more frequent than ever. I can't imagine how it's helped. I don't think the average understanding of game development by gamers has actually improved. And now it is just an echo chamber of rage. So I would say it's definitely, at best, neutral, but it's probably actually been quite harmful. Do you think studios like Activision Blizzard will be able to fix issues that have been coming up regarding misconduct? What would they need to do in order to become better places to work? Changing culture is hard. They've done. Oh, thank you for the upgrade. They've changed. So Blizzard has changed some very senior people. I feel like Ubisoft has been a bit more lip service in terms of what they've actually done. But they've brought in some people into senior positions. So it's hard to change culture. Very difficult. So I think some of it is about... Some of it is about getting the right leadership in place, so that is not just demonstrating the right culture, which is absolutely necessary, but also, oh, thank you very much, but also is not willing to accept in bad behavior from lower parts of the culture as well. And I think that they are starting to get people that at least are walking the right walk, but the question will be whether or not they're willing to go in there and basically shout down people that potentially could have been at the company for a very long time in order to change the culture. How did you manage to capture faces in mocap in the pandemic? Has it been a problem when you were at BioWare in 2020? So there wasn't a lot going on in 2020, but actually they were sending entire hardware packages to voice actors to set up and do it. So microphones and cameras and the whole works. We were, in my final days, we were looking to try to start doing mocap again. And actually, we did do some mocap in Vancouver. But it was kind of ridiculous because they were only letting one person on the stage. So they did actually capture a scene with one actor playing all the parts, which was an amazingly impressive technological feat, but I'm not entirely sure was worth the trouble. What is your opinion on the state of game industry in Canada and also Edmonton and the future of it? Do you have any recommendation for migrating to Canada for working in game industry and specifically at BioWare? So if you want to move to Canada for video games and you don't care where, move to Montreal. They have the most studios by far. I would actually say Edmonton is at the strongest Edmonton is the strongest it has ever been from a game industry perspective. We have BioWare, obviously, but you also have Beamdog, which I think has crossed 100 people now. You have Humanoid Studios, Casey's new studio. So there you have Improbable. So I would say that in the past, coming to Edmonton, it was BioWare or nothing. Now I think you at least have some options. We do have free healthcare in Canada, so that's nice. The only thing I would say is you basically need 4 years work experience or a 4-year degree to immigrate, I believe. So if you don't have that, it's going to be tricky. You mentioned one of the reasons you left BioWare is because Dragon Age is getting derailed. Doesn't that mean if it didn't get derailed, you would still be at BioWare, or would you have still left? There are lots of reasons. I had decided to leave a lot sooner than my actual resignation, so probably I would have still left. It's hard to say. What do you think about releasing books for a game like Dragon Age? Can that hurt the experience of playing the games? Many fans love these books, but there are in fact also many people that don't read these books and only play the games. Oh yeah, absolutely true. You have to remember that a best-selling book might sell 40,000 copies. A game that sold a AAA game that sold 40,000 copies would be a catastrophe. Most people haven't read your book, so I don't think it hurts. You just need to remember that most people who are playing your game have not read the book, so you can't rely on that knowledge. That's all. What do you think about the future of indie games in terms of discoverability? On average, 242 games were released each month on Steam. Will people be able to stand out without a publisher? Yeah, that is actually one of the major benefits that you get from a publisher these days, is the ability to get you noticed. I think it might become better if if somebody, maybe not even Steam, figures out something that's better at recommendations. So, like Netflix remains pretty good. YouTube is pretty good at recommending things that you might be interested in. I think that is possible to do within games. It hasn't really been done. Is YouTube now how you make a living, or is it rather an experiment in sharing my knowledge, or both? It is definitely not how I make a living. I think the total amount of money that I have been paid by YouTube is less than $200, so I hope that I don't have to survive on that much money. Definitely, right now, it's about sharing my knowledge. Will it become a significant source of income? It could. We shall see. There's a developer called Dan Tajnarian, first Dragon Age Origin trailers before the game's release. Whatever happened to him? So he was the executive producer of Origins. He was the second executive producer of Dragon Age Origins, and then I was the third one. He actually left BioWare, and he ended up starting a studio in Florida. What do I think of the current crop of games in the genre, BG3 and the like, and where do you think it might go with Critical Role's popularity? Yeah, I mean, D&D is at the most popular it has ever been. I think that it also is the least controversial it has ever been. So will it die down? Usually these sorts of things do eventually, but right now I think it's in a great place. Following the planned ideas for modern Jade Empire, have there ever been any other out there unexpected sequel ideas I've come up with? So I had, when I was on Handheld, I had a pitch for a base building game called Valley of the Sprightly Stones for Jade Empire as well. And I also had a pitch for a game that was basically designed to use as many of our assets as possible, where you would play, I think it was actually a character maybe from Revolver, but you would basically wander around and interact with characters from all of BioWare's games. I thought it would actually be kind of hilarious to build parties entirely out of characters played by the same voice actor. So like Vega and Iron Bull, and just get them all together at once. Have the actor acting against themselves. That's pretty out there. How well does agile dev methodology work with the concept of setting a release date for a game before you've scoped all the engineering effort? So I think agile is used almost universally these days in game development, or at least something that is called agile. As you correctly point out, it's not really how it's supposed to work. There is a growing understanding that setting your release date before you've even entered production is kind of silly. I don't know if that will ultimately, there will be a change made there, but maybe. What's your opinion on game modding, like classic game modding, making it more accessible, not things like skimpy clothing mods? How does it fit into the life of a franchise like fan art and cosplay? I really like mods. I know that we haven't been super supportive in recent days, but I think they're very important. They actually increase the longevity of a game immensely, because Skyrim has had mods and mods and mods and mods and mods and mods and mods, and people will constantly be posting things on that, and that keeps it in the conversation. They're great. Dragon Age Inquisition seems more of an action-based game, not a traditional RPG. Do you personally support it? I would argue that, much like is cereal a soup, the definition of what an RPG is has evolved immensely, and I would say that Dragon Age Inquisition is definitely an RPG. I do support that change. I think that you have to be aware of the audience you are building for sure. What do I mean by Dragon Age getting derailed? I just mean getting reset to, or the people being pulled off of it to work on other things, work on Andromeda, work on Anthem. So, okay, I put this one in here. Can ask you a lore question. We know that phylacteries are blood magic, and that once a blood mage, always blood mage. Have Vivian, Fiona, and Irving ever created one under all their time as first enchanters? I feel like this question has been asked a bunch of times on Twitter and stuff, and largely been ignored by the Dragon Age team, and I think I ignored it as well. But I'm going to answer it sort of now. Maybe not the answer they're hoping for, and I will say that yes, that probably makes sense, but maybe not. Because that is definitely for the Dragon Age team to decide, and if they haven't specified it as of yet, there may be a reason why they haven't. So it makes sense that they would have, but maybe not. Do you think the choices have harmed Dragon Age by restricting what they can do, and has BioWare considered canonizing choices in their games? Dragon Age actually has occasionally canonized some choices. It hasn't always been obvious, but yes, Dragon Age gets around this by this is one of the major reasons why it's a new protagonist, because it lets us move past romance choices and characters that may be living or dead. The biggest quantum consequence comes from Dragon Age Origins, which was basically built kind of with the assumption that there was never going to be another one, I think. So there was just a lot of quantum coming of Origins. The Dragon Age 2 and Dragon Age Inquisition have done a fairly good job of collapsing that by moving past the those things, or moving to different regions. I don't think that I think in the comics and the novels there's been a bit more canon collapsing. But I believe you should try to respect people's choices as much as you can possibly do so. I like to know how many iterations of a story are put together before the final one is okayed. Who calls the shots when it comes to the finalization of the story, and who gets input into it? Do non-writing team devs get to have a say? Is it all economics, i.e. cutscenes, voiceover talent requirements, etc., or are there more considerations beside that, and what are they? So there is a constant... iterations implies that there are like drafts, and that does happen, but it's much more fluid than that. And yeah, absolutely, non-writing team members get a say because some of it is economics. You've written something that cannot be built on any computer that currently exists, but also you want people outside the writing team to be providing feedback in terms of understandability and whether or not it makes any sense, or whether or not the impact is there. When it's written, when it's just down in writing and doesn't exist in the game, sometimes things that make sense or seem impactful because they're written right beside each other in a document, when they're in the game, are now suddenly 2 hours apart and lose all impact. So you need to have opportunities to reevaluate these things. How do you imagine... Oh, okay, I think I missed one. Let me just go back a little bit here. How do you manage all of that with limited consumer level feedback critical to agile development methodology? So in terms of, from an agile perspective, getting the feedback, so you do have customer surrogates. QA is partly that. You also do dailies to try to emulate that. I'm just going to do a couple here. Any thoughts on Nexus mods, T and C, regarding their potential ownership over people's mods? I mean, one of the reasons why Bethesda tried to do modding for pay and then pulled back was because the copyright is a minefield. I suspect that is likely a protective terms and service, but, you know, I guess we'll see. Oh, okay, that is actually the last one. Okay, apart from velocity, what metrics do you take the most seriously when determining if a project is on track? So for me, I've talked about triage a lot. If you're doing triage, and you should be doing triage, there is the ability to glean, this is late in the project, but you can glean the health of a project by the throughput of bugs and the inflow and outflow of bugs. I actually honestly think that is more accurate to the project's state than the actual velocity. Have there been any actual plans for Mass Effect or Dragon Age MMO games? I talked about this a little bit. Basically, no. There was a conversation on Dragon Age in like the very first couple of seconds of the game, but not really. Oh, thank you for the new membership. So Dragon Age Inquisition is a cheap translation of the console company with released. I don't agree with that, but I will say that with you need a platform champion, and because otherwise something's going to fall off. And so definitely you need someone who is putting the PC first. In QA, do the people performing the QA play the game blind, or is it preferred to have the people who have an idea of how the game is supposed to be played? Both, actually. You want both. Black box testing, purely, when you bring in new people, the very first thing you do is you basically have them sit down and play it as if they're a player as much as possible. Get that initial first reaction. But at the other extreme, you're going to QA embedded into the team that know exactly how it's going to work. Those people do become blind to the way things are working for sure, but you need both. Are the stats from previous games, how many people romanced or killed a character, taken into account when developing future contents, or do the writers try to ignore it? Yeah, we definitely do pay attention to that. You can go too far for sure, but you need to know that nobody plays a dwarf or everyone hates this romance character. Why did the Mass Effect iPhone game got removed from the store? I don't know. My guess is that it probably had some sort of legal problem, because the reason why, I know for a fact that the reason why the Last Court, the web game, got removed for Dragon Age was because of a legal reason, that it needed to be updated to some sort of new privacy laws, and was decided that it wasn't worth doing so. Okay. Will a game dev naturally move towards a development process that involves controlled release cycles to get user feedback and iterate, cling to predetermined release dates? I think that we will possibly end up in the long term towards something that is looking a lot more like mobile, where games get released and then iterate out in the wild, but I don't know. It's one of the problems that AAA has had evolving its process is the cycles are long, so the learnings take a long time. Okay, we reached the bottom. I've run out of questions. Thank you, everyone who gave a chat, and thank you, everyone who became a member. If you enjoyed this, maybe we'll do this again in 5,000 more subscribers. Okay, and then one last question. Do I think that Dragon Age 4 is going to hit the 100 gigabyte mark? There are still some hardware limitations there in terms of publishers don't want you to go to multiple discs if you can possibly avoid it. It makes things really a lot more expensive because you need different packaging and an extra disc. As long as we have physical copies being a significant part of the development process, I suspect the answer is no, but we'll see. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to push this big red button right now. Goodbye. End.